Captain Kai Thorne stood at attention, his dress uniform crisp despite the weight of 3 years of war pressing down on his bones. The thin scar that cut from his temple to his jaw caught the pale station light, a silent reminder of battles. Survived but never forgotten. Beyond the viewport, the void stretched endlessly black, cold, and merciless. Somewhere in that vast silence, the remnants of a war that had claimed millions drifted in ruins. And somewhere beyond those ruins, waiting in the shadows of fragile peace, was his new bride. The thought struck him like a pulse of plasma fire, unwanted and jarring. He hadn't agreed to any of this, not yet. The hiss of the doors breaking, the sterile silence snapped him from the edge of those thoughts. Admiral Morrison stepped in, his presence heavy with authority and years of command. His weathered face looked older than Kai remembered, lines carved deep by the burden of choices no one should have to make. "Kai," Morrison said, voice clipped, pragmatic as ever. "At ease." Kai shifted his stance, but didn't relax. The old man's tone told him this wasn't going to be another tactical debrief. This was something else. Something worse. "You understand why you're here," Morrison began, walking toward the central holotable. It flickered to life, casting blue-white light across the room, across Kai's face. A single image formed tall, graceful, otherworldly. She stood as if sculpted from living sapphire, her skin a luminous shade of blue that shimmered softly like starlight on calm water. Her hair fell in a cascade of deep crimson curls, a startling contrast to her silver eyes that seemed to pierce. Through the projection, through light and distance, straight into him. Kai's jaw tightened. "Who is that?" "Princess Val-Ara," Morrison said, voice even. "Zion Empire's highest-ranking royal. And the reason you're here." Kai stared, not at the title, not at the alien beauty, but at the implication coiling like a predator. In the Admiral's words, "Go on. The peace talks are concluded. Terms signed. The war is over." Morrison hesitated, a pause that said everything. "But there's a condition." Kai felt something cold settle in his gut. "What kind of condition?" Morrison's gaze locked on his, unflinching. "You're going to marry her." The words detonated in his mind, louder than any artillery strike. He almost laughed, but it came out as something closer to a snarl. "Marry?" "Admiral, I'm a soldier, not—" "This isn't a request," Morrison cut in sharply. "It's what's required to keep the treaty intact." The Zion Empire demanded a bonding ceremony, their most sacred tradition, a symbol that this alliance is more than words on paper. Kai's fists clenched behind his back. "You're asking me to be a bargaining chip, a peace offering." "I'm asking you," Morrison said, voice dropping to something like regret, "to save billions of lives from another decade of war." Kai looked back at the hologram, at the alien woman who had unknowingly become the center of his fury, his confusion. He fought to steady his voice. "Why me?" The Admiral's answer was soft but heavy. "Because she requested you by name." The silence that followed was suffocating. His pulse hammered in his ears. Requested him? How in all the void did she even know his name? Before he could speak, the doors slid open with a whisper of hydraulics. The air in the room shifted, charged. Alive. Kai turned and froze. No projection this time. No screen between them. She walked into the chamber like a fragment of some alien dawn made flesh, her presence bending the sterile room into something electric. The ceremonial robe flowed around her like liquid night, and her silver eye stars condensed into human foam locked on him, with an intensity that stole the breath from his lungs. "Captain Thorne," she said, her voice melodic, each syllable carrying the weight of galaxies. And just like that, everything Kai thought he knew about this war, about duty, about himself shifted. Asterisk, the grand temple of Harmony Station rose like a jewel, suspended in the void, its crystal spires piercing the artificial sky of the station's interior dome. Light refracted through intricate panes, scattering across the vaulted ceiling in shimmering constellations. It was a marvel of diplomacy, an architectural union of human precision and Zion elegance. But for Captain Kai Thorne, it might as well have been a prison of glass. He stood rigid at the altar, his formal military dress uniform polished to perfection, metals gleaming under the ethereal glow. The weight of them dug into his chest like anchors. But it wasn't the metal that made his throat tight. It was the knowledge that this moment was being broadcast to billions. Every colony, every Zion province, every soldier who'd bled for this war, they were all watching. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the soft hum of translation devices. On his left, human officials lined the pews in their finest uniforms, their faces carved from stone. On his right, Zion nobility sat in robes that shimmered like living starlight. Two species divided by centuries of mistrust, brought together in a single room, pretending unity could be forged in a day. Kai's hands remained steady at his sides, but his pulse thudded like distant artillery. He had faced death in fire and vacuum, stared into the maws of war machines without flinching. Yet this slow march toward a future he didn't choose made him feel like a raw recruit again. A chime sounded, deep and resonant, rolling through the temple like the voice of some ancient god. The great doors at the far end parted with solemn grace. And then she appeared. Princess Val-Ara of the Zion Empire walked with a poise that defied gravity, her every step a study in balance and command. Her ceremonial robe was woven from threads of deep blue that caught the light like liquid crystal, embroidered with silver sigils that pulsed faintly as if alive. Her crimson curls were coiled in an intricate braid, pinned with shards of crystal that flared like frozen fire. A gossamer veil veiled her face, but through it, those silver eyes burned, two cold suns that seared straight into him. Kai's breath hitched despite himself. He had expected grandeur, arrogance, the untouchable grace of an alien monarch. What he hadn't expected was the subtle tremor in her hands as she held the ceremonial staff. It was small, barely there, but he saw it. And in that moment, something shifted in him, a crack in the image of the perfect, imperious princess. She was nervous. She reached the altar and turned to face him, the delicate veil softening her alien beauty without hiding the intensity of her gaze. When their eyes locked, the world narrowed to the space between them. No words, no cameras, no audience, just the silence where two fates collided. The High Priestess of Zera Prime stepped forward, her voice a melodic cadence as she began the ritual in the ancient Zerian tongue. The sound rolled through the hall like liquid crystal, smooth and unbroken, carrying meanings Kai could only guess at. His earpiece whispered a hollow translation. Do you, Ithorn of Terra, accept the sacred bond that transcends flesh and spirit? Kai swallowed hard. His voice didn't shake, though his heart did. I do. The priestess turned to Val-Ara. Her reply was soft, but even through the translator, it carried a gravity that made the hairs on his neck rise. I do. Then came the binding cords woven from threads that shimmered like starlight, wrapping around their wrists in an intricate spiral. When her skin brushed his, a warmth flared beneath his flesh, spreading like molten metal through his veins. He bit back a startled breath, eyes flicking to hers. Her pupils widened slightly. She'd felt it too. Next was the chalice and artifact, carved from crystal older than human history, filled with liquid that glowed faintly like bottled nebulae. They drank in turn. The taste was sweet and alien, and as it slid down his throat, the warmth from her touch deepened into something stranger, something that hummed along the edges of his consciousness. The bond is sealed, the priestess declared, her voice ringing like a bell in the hushed chamber. Applause rippled through the hall, polite and practiced, but Kai barely heard it because in that moment, as the chords fell away and Val'ara lifted her gaze to his, he saw something flicker in her silver eyes. Not victory, not calculation. Something rawer, something that made his chest ache in a way no battlefield ever had. The ceremony was done, the alliance secured. But as the hall erupted in orchestrated celebration, Kai knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something vast and unknowable, and deep in his gut, a single thought took root and refused to let go. Whatever he had expected this night to be, he had been wrong. Dead wrong. The corridors beyond the Grand Temple were hushed, their silence a stark contrast to the roaring celebration that echoed faintly from the great hall. Kai walked beside Val'ara, his boots striking the polished floor in perfect cadence with the soft, measured steps of her bare feet. They moved through a world suspended between two cultures, half-sharp human steel, half-flowing Xerian crystal. The glow of starlight lamps cast long, fractured shadows that slid across the walls like restless ghosts. Every sensor, every camera had been deactivated for this part of the ritual. The galaxy might have been watching their vows, but this what came next was private, sacred. Kai's shoulders ached beneath the weight of his uniform jacket. His thoughts snarled in the tension of expectation. He had braced for this moment since Morrison first uttered those impossible words. "You're going to marry her." And through all the chaos, one truth had burned in his mind. This night would not belong to him. It would be a transaction sealed in whispers and skin, the oldest currency of peace. Asterisk. The door to their quarters slid open with a sigh. Warm, golden light spilled into the corridor, carrying the faint scent of something floral, an alien of fragrance that clung to memory like silk. She entered first, and he followed, the door, sealing behind them with a finality that stole his breath. The room was a compromise between worlds. Human angles and clean lines softened by Xerian curves. Crystalline arches flowing like frozen rivers across the ceiling. A single viewport dominated one wall, offering a breathtaking vista of space, an endless sea of stars stitched with the silver threads of distant nebulae. The bed, if it could be called that, was an elegant expanse of interwoven fabric and biolattice. Glowing faintly from within, as though alive, Kai's throat tightened. This was no sterile treaty chamber. This was intimate. He turned and froze. Val'ara stood near the center of the room, her slender fingers unclasping the crystal fastenings of her ceremonial headdress. One by one, they fell away with the soft chime of glass on glass. Crimson curls tumbled free, cascading over her shoulders in molten waves. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked real, not a symbol, not a sovereign. A woman. "You're staring," she said softly. Her voice carrying the cadence of star song. Kai jerked his gaze aside, heat crawling up his neck. "Sorry, I don't apologize." She set the headdress gently on a low table, then reached for the shimmering torque at her throat. Her hands were steady now, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. Each piece of jewelry removed was placed with reverence, as though shedding layers of expectation. The transformation was stark. The princess who had commanded armies, who had stood like living marble at the altar, was dissolving before his eyes into someone far more fragile and far more dangerous to his composure. When the last ornament lay on the table, she turned to him fully. Her silver eyes held his like twin moons pulling at his tide. "May I ask you something, Kai Thorne?" The sound of his name on her lips struck him like a pulse round. "Of course. What did your diplomats tell you of Xerian bonding customs?" Kai shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how tight his uniform felt. "They said physical intimacy might be expected, that it's part of solidifying the alliance." Ara's smile was faint, almost sad. Your diplomats understand nothing. Before he could speak, she began loosening the clasps of her outer robe. The fabric whispered as it slid from her shoulders, pooling around her feet like liquid midnight. Beneath, a simple garment clung to the contours of her blue-toned skin, tracing the elegant lines of her body without artifice. Kai's pulse hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed to look away, but he couldn't not when her movements held no seduction, only solemnity. "This is not about politics," she said, stepping closer, her bare feet silent on the crystalline floor. "Not about heirs, not even about duty." He swallowed hard. "Then what is it about?" Her fingers brushed the scar along his jaw, cool and delicate, and he flinched not from fear, but from the surge of heat that followed. "It is about this," she murmured, her voice low and fierce. "Two souls, stripped of pretense. Two beings, who will either open themselves completely or break under the weight of secrecy." His breath caught. "I don't understand." "You will." Her hand lingered against his cheek, her silver eyes softening with something like hope. "But first, you must answer me truthfully. Are you willing to let me see who you truly are, Kai Thorne? Not the soldier, not the hero, the man beneath all that armor?" Silence stretched, taut as a drawn wire. He thought of the war, of friends, buried in the dust of shattered worlds, of choices that still bled inside him like open wounds. And he knew whatever she was asking, whatever door she was about to open, there would be no closing it again. "Yes," he said, his voice hoarse, with something raw. "Show me." Her lips curved not in triumph, but relief so profound it looked like pain. "Then remove your uniform," she whispered, "and let me teach you what it means to be truly known." As the first clasp gave way beneath his fingers, Kai felt the ground tilt beneath him. Whatever he had expected of this night, he was certain now. He had been wrong, dead wrong. Asterisk. The silence in their quarters thickened as Kai's fingers fumbled with the fastenings of his jacket. The sharp click of metal against metal sounded impossibly loud in the warm hush of the room. His pulse thundered in his ears, not with the heat of desire, but with the weight of something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. Foul. Ara waited, her presence as still and poised as a blade balanced on its edge. She stood close enough for him to feel the cool aura of her skin, her silver eyes fixed on him like twin moons pulling at tides he didn't know existed inside him. When his jacket slid to the floor in a heavy whisper, her gaze softened, the smallest crack in her flawless composure. "This is not what you imagine," she said, her voice carrying the lilt of starlight, soft, melodic, but thrumming with restrained power. "Then tell me," Kai murmured, his throat dry as dust. "What is this?" Ara stepped closer, and for a moment he thought she might kiss him. Instead, she raised her hand and touched his temple with fingers that felt like cool glass warmed by sunlight. A shiver rippled through him, not from fear, but from the strange hum that sparked beneath his skin at her touch. "This," she whispered, "is the joining." Kai opened his mouth to speak, but the world shattered light silver, and molten blue flooded his vision, drowning the walls, the floor, his sense of self. It rushed into him like a tidal wave of stars, and for a heartbeat he couldn't breathe. Then the wave carried him under, and everything he thought he knew about her, about himself, dissolved into a kaleidoscope of alien memory. He was no longer in the quarters on Harmony Station. He was standing on a balcony of living crystal, the wind tasting of ozone and flowers, with no name in any human tongue. Spires of coral and light curved toward a violet sky where twin suns bled gold across the horizon. He looked down small. Hands, slender, blue-tinted. A child's hands. Her hands. "I was never just a child," her voice murmured, not in his ears, but inside his mind, like a thought that wasn't his own. "From the moment I could walk, I was told what I would be. Heir. Strategist. The spine of an empire. The scene shifted like sand in a storm. Now he was older. She was older, seated in a chamber of glass and shadow, her crimson curls bound in gold, her silver eyes dulled with exhaustion, as tutors droned on about treaties and battle formations. Around her, voices rose arguing, pleading, condemning. War had come, swift and merciless. And in her chest burned the raw terror of a leader too young to carry the weight of a dying civilization. Kai felt it all, the isolation, the suffocating mantle of duty, the bitter taste of choices made with no good outcomes. He felt the nights she wept in silence for soldiers who would never return, for civilians buried under firestorms she couldn't stop. And through it all, one thought thrummed like a wound that would never heal. There must be another way. Memory bent again, folding in on itself, and suddenly he stood in a war room scarred by desperation. Star charts glowed before him, while casualty reports streamed like rivers of blood. And there, in the stillness between two heartbeats, came the decision that broke her. If peace cannot be taken, it must be given, even if it costs me everything I dreamed for myself. Kai tore free of the memory with a gasp, staggering as if he'd run miles through alien skies. His lungs dragged in air like a drowning man. But before he could speak, her hand found his, grounding him, pulling him back from the edge of that endless ocean. Her eyes shone soft now, shimmering with something rawer than power. "Now," she whispered, her breath ghosting against his cheek. "Let me see you." He didn't resist. He couldn't. Something deep in him, some door he'd kept locked. For years swung open, and then she was inside him. The storm hit hard, his childhood on New Geneva, the thrill and terror of first enlistment, the stench of burning metal on Kepler's broken plains. He felt her recoil at the roar of human artillery, the crash of shattered bodies, but she didn't turn away. She followed him deeper, through every battlefield, every sleepless night weighed down by ghosts. She saw his defiance when superiors ordered him to break every rule of honor, saw his hands shaking as he refused to kill civilians, heard the hollow rasp of his whisper to a dying Xerian soldier, a boy, barely more than a child promising mercy he could not give. "You think the war made you a monster." Her voice trembled inside his mind, fierce and tender all at once. "But all I see is a man who bled for his principles." Kai choked back a sound half-sob, half-laugh as the last walls crumbled. Memories spilled like light between them, blending until he could no longer tell where he ended and she began. Her loneliness coiled around his grief, her hope braided with his regret, until their thoughts pulsed in tandem, like twin stars locked in the same orbit. When his eyes fluttered open, the world had narrowed to her face, close enough for her breath to mingle with his. "What?" His voice broke, raw and ragged. "What are we now?" Her answer was a whisper and a vow. Not two, not anymore. And then she kissed him, and it wasn't fire or hunger or even love as humans understood it. It was surrender the pure, terrifying surrender of two souls falling into the same abyss and discovering wings instead of stone. Asterisk. For the first time in 3 years of endless war, Kai felt something like peace. And in that quiet, shattering instant, he understood the truth, whatever this was. It was more than a treaty. It was forever. Asterisk. Kai woke before the light panels warmed to morning hue. For a moment, he thought he was still dreaming, floating in that ocean of starlight where her thoughts had brushed against his, tender and unrelenting. Then he realized the sensation hadn't faded. It was still there. She was still there. Even with his eyes closed, he felt her, a quiet pulse in his mind, like the hum of distant engines, constant and alive. Her emotions ebbed through him in soft waves, calm, layered with something fragile beneath it, like the thinnest thread of hope. When her breathing shifted from the slow rhythm of sleep to something more wakeful, the awareness blossomed, warm and startling, as if it had happened inside his own chest. Kai opened his eyes. She lay beside him, the pale glow from the viewport, tracing silver across her blue-toned skin. Her crimson hair spilled over the pillow like a river of fire, tangled and imperfect in a way that made her look heartbreakingly real. For a long breath, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Then her voice a whisper meant only for him. "Good morning, beloved." The word landed softly, but carried a depth that twisted in his chest. His earpiece would have rendered it in standard as something sterile spouse, partner, but in her tone, it meant more. It meant one who completes my soul. And somehow, he knew that without translation. Kai pushed himself up slowly, muscles aching with the exhaustion of what they had shared, not physical, though that had come too, but something far deeper, something that left his bones humming like struck glass. He dragged a hand through his hair, trying to steady the storm inside him. "I feel different." Her lips curved in a small smile as she sat up, the sheets whispering against her skin. "You are. We both are." Kai stared at her, his voice low, rough-edged. "What happened last night? That wasn't just intimacy." "No." She reached for his hand and laced her fingers with his, the contact sparking a low thrum in his chest. That was joining. Complete vulnerability. Complete trust. He swallowed hard. "And this," he tapped a finger lightly against his temple, "this connection, it doesn't fade, does it?" Her silver eyes softened, and for the first time, he saw something like fear flicker there. "No, Kai, it never fades." The air seemed to thin, his breath catching like he'd taken a punch to the gut. "So what? You mean I'll feel you? In my head? For the rest of my life?" Her thumb brushed his scar gently, soothing, but her words held the gravity of stars collapsing. "Not just feel me. You are me now, as I am you. Two minds, two hearts, woven into something that can't be undone." A shiver crawled down his spine. Part of him recoiled at the permanence, the enormity of it, but another part, deeper and truer, felt a pull he couldn't fight, a belonging. So fierce it was almost pain. "Why didn't you tell me before?" His voice was quiet, but sharp at the edges. "Because knowing would have made you fear it," she said simply. "And fear would have broken the bond before it began." Kai turned away, staring out at the ocean of stars beyond the viewport. The weight of it pressed in on him, heavy and relentless, the understanding that he was no longer just human, no longer just Kai Thorne. He was more, something uncharted, and then the chime shattered the fragile stillness. He stiffened instinctively, every nerve snapping taut as Admiral Morrison's voice spilled through the comm panel, ragged with disbelief. "Captain Thorne, Princess Val Ara, I hope I'm not interrupting, whatever the hell you're doing, but we have a situation." Val Ara rose with a grace that made the room feel too small, her crimson hair gleaming like fire in the glow of the stars. She moved to the comm console, her robe flowing around her like liquid night. "Explain," she said, her voice carrying the weight of command. There was a pause on the line, a hesitation that told Kai this wasn't some routine diplomatic flare-up. When Morrison spoke again, his words were thick with something between awe and alarm. "Negotiators are reporting changes. Zirian envoys suddenly understanding human emotional cues without translation. Our diplomats saying they can anticipate Zirian responses like instinct, it's spreading fast. The only thing they have in common is they were all present at your ceremony." Kai felt Val Ara's hand slip into his before he realized she'd crossed the room. Her grip was firm, grounding, but her thoughts, he could feel them like whispers. Under his skin, she didn't look at him when she spoke, but her voice was calm, almost too calm. "Admiral, it's not a diplomatic anomaly." She squeezed Kai's fingers, and through that touch came a pulse of certainty that made his stomach drop. "It's the bond. It's resonating." Morrison's silence crackled like static. "Then?" Hoarse and wary. "You're telling me your wedding night just rewired two species?" Kai turned to Val Ara, searching her silver eyes for denial, for doubt. "There was none. Only truth and something deeper." "No," she said softly, her gaze locking with his as a shiver of understanding passed between them like lightning. "Not two species, Admiral." Her voice was steady, but in Kai's mind, her unspoken thought rang louder than any alarm. The entire galaxy, asterisk the council chamber, was a cathedral of glass and metal, its soaring arches alive with the muted glow of diplomatic banners, human crests flanking the luminous glyphs of the Xerian Empire. It had been designed to symbolize unity. Tonight, it felt like a fault line about to crack wide open. Kai stood at the center of the chamber, boots planted on the obsidian floor that reflected the fractured constellations beyond the viewport. Beside him, Val Ara moved with that same impossible grace, her crimson hair spilling over robes that shimmered like midnight fire. Yet beneath the calm lines of her posture, he felt it, the quiet storm inside her, through the bond that hummed like a second heartbeat in his veins. Room was crowded with power. Admirals in crisp dress whites, Xerian elders draped in ceremonial silks, negotiators whose voices had shaped empires, now reduced to whispers tinged with awe and fear. Morrison stood near the dais, his jaw a hard line, his weathered face unreadable. As he stared at Kai like a man watching a missile he didn't launch, but now couldn't stop. "Explain it," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying like the crack of a gunshot. "What the hell did you two do?" Kai opened his mouth, but Val Ara spoke first, her tone a calm blade slicing through the tension. "We did what our traditions demand," she said. "What was required to bind our peoples in trust. We joined." "Joined?" One of the human counselors barked out a brittle laugh, his voice shaking with nerves. "That's what you call this? Half my staff can't stop feeling things. I've got hardened admirals telling me they suddenly understand Xerian art, for God's sake." On the other side of the chamber, a Xerian elder rose, her silver eyes luminous with something, perilously close to tears. "Our diplomats sense human motives as if they were our own," she said softly, reverently. "We speak, and they know what we mean before words fall. Such clarity. It has never existed between our species." The murmurs swelled, fear and wonder twining like smoke. Kai felt it pressing against his mind, the swell of doubt, the hunger for control. And through it all, Val Ara's thoughts brushed his, steady and fierce. "Hold fast. Do not let them twist this into a weapon." Kai stepped forward, his voice cutting through the din like steel drawn from a sheath. "You're all asking the wrong question. This isn't about what we did. It's about what happens next." Dozens of eyes locked on him, human and Xerian alike. The weight of their scrutiny was a physical thing, heavy as any battlefield armor. He drew a breath, tasting ozone and inevitability. "When we joined," he said slowly, "we didn't just share memories. We became something new, not two people, one mind, one pulse, and somehow that resonance didn't stay with us. It's radiating. Every person who stood near the altar yesterday is changed, bridged. They feel what the other feels, understand what they couldn't before." Morrison's jaw tightened. "You're telling me you've created what? A psychic contagion?" "No." Val Ara's voice slid in like silk over steel, firm and unyielding. "Not contagion, communion." Gasps rippled through the chamber, but she didn't stop. She moved to stand beside Kai, her presence a column of living fire. For centuries, our species waged war because we could not fathom each other. Every treaty was brittle because it rested on word shadows of thought, easily broken. But this, her hand found Kai's, fingers lacing with his, as their joined consciousness pulsed outward in a wave so subtle, no one saw it, but everyone felt it. Tension bled from the room like ink in water. Voices stilled. Heartbeats slowed. "This is understanding without translation," she said softly. "Empathy without suspicion. It is what your philosophers dreamed of, and ours sang of. Under violet skies, a bridge no starship could ever build." One of the Xerian elders leaned forward, his voice trembling like a man on the edge of faith. "Do you mean to say this joining could spread?" Kai felt the answer rise in her and in him, because now they were the same answer. He let the words fall like a gauntlet. "Yes, if we choose it, if we guide it, and if you don't?" Morrison asked, his voice sharp with the fear of a soldier staring down an unknown weapon. Kai met his gaze, steady as the event horizon of a collapsing star. "Then this ends with us. Two souls forever bound, carrying a secret into silence." The chamber held its breath. Kai felt it all, the hunger, the hope, the terror, curling like smoke in every mind. And through the bond, he felt Val Ara's truth flood him, fierce and luminous. We were never meant to hide. This is not accident. This is the next step. He squeezed her hand, turned to the assembly, and for the first time since the war began, his voice rang with something that felt like certainty. 3 years ago, I thought the only way to protect my people was through fire and steel. Yesterday, I thought peace meant surrendering my freedom. I was wrong. Peace isn't a treaty inked in blood or a line carved into stars. It's this. He drew Val Ara closer, the shimmer of her presence radiating like dawn, breaking across dark worlds. Two species, two histories, two hearts woven into one truth. Silence held for a single trembling heartbeat. Then the Xerian elder her, voice soft as prayer, spoke what everyone else could only feel. Perhaps the stories were true. Perhaps the stars always meant for us to meet. And as the chamber erupted not in anger, but in awe, Kai turned to Val Ara. Through her eyes, through the pulse of their joined souls, he saw 1,000 tomorrows unfurling like a tide of light. No war. No walls. Just bridges, stretching between. Worlds. And for the first time in his life, Kai Thorne believed. The end